All right, hi everyone. My name is Melissa Jerome, and I am the project coordinator or manager for the Florida and Puerto Rico Digital Newspaper Project, which is a project that's housed at the University of Florida Libraries. We partner with the University of Puerto Rico to digitize historic newspapers that are available on microfilm, and then we make them publicly available. But I'm not here to talk to you about my project, so to say, today. What I'm here to tell you about is best practices for project management and collaborating. So essentially what I plan to do today is just give you a little bit of an overview as to what project management is and its different elements, as is designated by the Project Management Institute, or the PMI, who's kind of like the governing body over project management, and they're a global institution. So we'll go ahead and get started. So before we go into project management, I wanted to just clarify what a project is. And that is a temporary endeavor that produces a unique result. So anything from producing a product, an enhancement to a product, a new type of product, a service even, or as well as a document, or like think of like a research paper, or an actual digitization of a collection. So I have some examples here listed for you. So it really can range in a lot of things, but the key points to remember is that it is temporary, so it does have a definite end date and end product or end service. So what is project management? According to PMI, it is actively applying knowledge, skills, tools, and techniques to meet project objectives. They divide project management into 5 basic project areas, and those being initiating, planning and executing, monitoring, controlling, and then closing of the project. As you notice here in this diagram is that the monitoring and controlling process is something that's done throughout the entirety of the project process. But the other thing to keep in mind that's important as well with project management is that this process is iterative. So it's going to continually be applied, and you're going to be continuously adapting and enrolling new, essentially like new implementations to your projects. So project management, even though it's divided into 5 basic knowledge areas, the PMI has it listed as if you are essentially completing 47 processes. And I'm not going through all of those today. I'm going to give you just a very brief overview as to what the key main elements of project management are. But I did also want to make note that they also explain that just because they have these like guidelines, they're just guidelines exactly. So you don't have to follow everything that they list out to the T. You kind of have to implement things as you see fit for your own projects. So project management is what do you do to manage your project? You use project management when you have a formalized need for things, when you're working on things like a project that has technologically or is technically complex. So something like a really big project, like with what I do, where we digitize collections, we have multiple partners, we have multiple outcomes. If there's budget or scheduling constraints, that's also important to keep in mind, where you might want to then implement some project management basics to help further schedule and implement changes. If you have several activities that are going to need to be integrated, or if you're working, again, like in partnerships or in a big organization where you're going to have multiple interconnecting departments and units that are all playing different parts in this project to accomplish this goal. So many projects fail because of insufficient attention to checking that there's a valid business case. So one of the things that you should definitely do before you start a project is determine if there's a justification, like is there a need for undertaking this project? If not, then maybe you should reevaluate, redetermine what your scope would be. Also, insufficient definition of what your outcomes are. So if you're coming in with this idea, but you don't really have any outcomes or set ideas in mind as to like what you want the end product to be, then maybe you need to also take a step back, think things out, reevaluate, maybe talk with your partners if you're planning on partnering, and then kind of reassess the situation before you kind of dig in deep into trying to take on a big endeavor like a project. Another reason why projects fail is due to lack of communication with your stakeholders, and we're going to touch upon all these things a little bit more as we go through. Or even the idea of like having the wrong project manager on board. If this person doesn't have the communication or management skills needed to make sure that your project is successful, then you again need to reevaluate and maybe bring on someone else. So project management is important because it's going to help you enhance your decision making. It's going to essentially increase your overall project planning. So there's a lot of project plans, all these plans that I'll kind of go over a little bit for the different constraints that could potentially affect a project negatively. And we'll go through it some more, but essentially what project management is that you want to plan accordingly ahead of time. Think of things, anything and everything you can possibly think of for this project ahead of time so you have some sort of plans in place before you actually get things rolling. So you're going to do things like set plans so that you can optimize your time and your resources, as well as potentially identify any risks and mitigate these risks. So the very first step in project management is initiating. And this consists of the processes that you perform to define a new project or a new phase of a project. This is going to involve things like defining your scope. So what are you trying to accomplish? What activities need to be achieved, and what work needs to be done to achieve those activities and that outcome? Some projects will need to acquire finances. So you need to make sure that you have that on board from the very beginning so you're not trying to make these big grand schemes to accomplish something and then not have the funds to do so. You want to identify the stakeholders. So stakeholders, think of this as anyone and everyone, whether it be internal to your project or external to your project, that can be affected or affect your project. So with our project, for instance, stakeholders would be the University of Florida Libraries, the University of Puerto Rico Libraries, the Library of Congress, and the National Endowment for the Humanities that fund and manage our project on a national level. Everyone in the UF and UPR community, and then the community at large, because what we're doing is digitizing newspapers and making them accessible to the public. So we're increasing knowledge, increasing access to information. So you have to kind of think at least of like the main stakeholders that are going to be affected or that can have a high impact on your project. So if you are doing research, think of this kind of as your initial planning phase. Like, what are you thinking of as a topic? What's known about your topic? What approaches can you use to tackle this topic? At the end of the initiating phase, you're going to have a project charter, which essentially goes ahead and it gives you like a statement and objective of everything from the roles and responsibilities that all the stakeholders involved are going to undertake, and then as well as defining like what your objectives are. So what we've given out is a handout that you all should each have. But this is just for you to take away, just kind of explaining a little bit more of all these elements that a project charter can have. Definitely worth starting one if you're thinking of starting a project and kind of going through these different elements so that you can plan accordingly. So we'll go through. So from the project charter, I'm going to end up eventually telling you a little bit more about your stakeholders, for instance, the implementation process, and then going through other constraints in a project, such as like cost, quality of products, if you're actually trying to develop a product, how to mitigate risks in general, your resources, such as the people that you're going to be managing. So we'll go ahead and... So your stakeholder register, I kind of call this like my little cheat sheet. It's more for internal purposes. So essentially, what I would recommend doing, so you keep track of all the stakeholders that are participating in your project. You create this list, and it could, be expanded or decreased how you see fit. But this is just a template that I use. And it's essentially, I don't have all the correct information on here, but so-and-so who is a stakeholder in our project, what their title is, what their role is with our project, what their contact information would be. So do I want to contact them through email, through phone, through address, et cetera. And then interest and influence. And I feel like this is definitely a key to mention. If you have a stakeholder who has high influence, you definitely want to make sure that you're giving them priority and making sure that you're meeting their expectations, because if they have high influence and can essentially shut down or cancel funding for your project, you want to make sure that you're keeping someone like that happy and you're meeting their expectations. And then the same with their communication requirements. So is this a person who likes to receive emails from you for every single little thing that you do? Or do they only want a report every couple of months? Do they absolutely hate technology and want to meet with you in person? So kind of keeping that in mind so that you know how to approach your stakeholders. So planning is the second phase of project management. And we're going to go through some of these, most of these, throughout the rest of the slides. But essentially with planning, again, like I mentioned earlier, you're going to go through and essentially create plans of action, tackle plans for all of these constraints that could potentially have negative impacts on your project so that you can hopefully avoid them and have a successful outcome. So think of this as mapping out your strategies and tactics, and essentially, again, identifying your stakeholders and course of actions that you need to complete your project and your goals. So things that this could include would be reviewing your project aims, analyzing the work that needs to be done, and further developing work tasks. So taking one big project and making the subtasks, figuring out what the subtasks would be, so that then you can assign individual people to those minor tasks. You're not taking on one big project that could be divided into smaller activities. And then you're going to essentially develop a schedule, and then as well as, again, consider any resources that you may need in terms of not just equipment, but also people and funding, of course, which could also be a really big problem, like it is with our project. It's you need money to digitize newspapers. You need money to put them up. So keeping those things in mind. So in terms of scheduling, this involves you thinking about the resources that you need, not just the technology and the equipment, but the people. So think about who's going to do the work. What type of skills do they need to know, or knowledge do they need to know? How much time is it going to take them to actually complete these tasks? And so what I would suggest doing is starting off with an activity list, where you would create a very detailed list of all the activities that you can possibly do with your project. And the PMI kind of goes into more detail. I'm kind of keeping this at the very surface level. They have what they call these work breakdown structures, where you would essentially create what looks like an organization chart, but instead of for your organization, it's for all the tasks that you have to complete. So you would use, I'm just going to go with an activity list, which is just as effective for most projects. And essentially on this activity list, you're going to go ahead and note what the activity is, what resources are needed, so if you need specific equipment, how many people you need to work on it, and then give an estimate of how much time that task is going to take to complete. And then you're going to use that activity list to create things like a logic diagram, which I have displayed here. And this is just to kind of help you think before you actually start to schedule what tasks need to be done when, if there's any dependencies, so that you can appropriately plan your schedule for your project. So the logic diagram is used to calculate your critical path, and the critical path I'm going to go over a little bit more in the next slide. So you have your logic diagram, which is one way to at least help you get started with your scheduling, but then your scheduling, you're going to use presentation or visualization techniques like an action plan. So do you want to actually have a document where you're just going to write out what needs to be done? Do you want to use a Gantt chart, which I'll show you an example of in a minute? And then creating calendars for the task, or even work calendars so you know who's working what times and for how long. And then, of course, it's important to monitor your progress. And your scheduling will help you with that, because you can kind of see, okay, well, I'll show you with the Gantt chart. If you're knowing that you need to complete a task by a certain day, and you're not on that task, then these charts are essentially just going to help you better monitor and assess, do I need to maybe add more resources? Or are we ahead of schedule, and can I maybe then decrease resources? So this is just an example of a critical path. What I went ahead and did was just use activity examples of things that we do with my project, and created this table to show the dependencies, and then just kind of use these hypothetical numbers. This is not really how long it takes us to do these things. I just did this for the purpose of the activity. But essentially what you would do with this is you're going to create a logic diagram to then determine what is called the critical path. And the critical path represents the longest path through a project, which determines the shortest possible duration for the project. So you would essentially, and we'll go through it to show you. So you create this logic diagram using the table. So backspace. So using this table, noting the dependencies, obviously it helps to have these side by side, but for purposes of presentation, we'll stick with this. So you're going to pay attention to the dependencies, and then the duration dates will be the second step. So you create a logic diagram, and the important thing to note with critical path is just because a path may have more activities doesn't necessarily mean it's the critical path. The critical path is the path that takes the longest amount of time. So that essentially, this is the more simple version. Project management with the PMI, they go into what's called the critical path method, which is much more intense than this. What they do is they look at early start and late start for each activity, and then kind of do these like forward and backward pass calculations so that you can actually calculate what they call float for each activity, which then tells you like how much slack time or how much leeway time you have between each activity. So you know essentially like how many days, hours, weeks, et cetera, however it is you want to calculate it, but what your free float time would be between activities. So looking at something like this, go ahead and sequence out what the activities would be. And then, oh, I didn't load the right one, I guess. I'm sorry. So essentially what you would do is right above each of these tasks, you would write in the duration of each time that it's going to take each one to take. And I'm sorry, I guess we uploaded the wrong presentation. We do have slides up online, and I'll share the link with everyone in case anyone wants to review this later. But essentially what you do is you write down the durations on top, and then this one's a little more simple. I've seen some that get much more complex and have like 3, 4, 5 pathways, or some that even converge multiple times. It really depends on what your project is and what your activities are. But you would essentially identify each path first. So you would start at start, and then mine is very simple. A, B, C, down to E, F, G, H, end would be path 1. Path 2 would be start, then D, E, F, G, H, end. And so you would go ahead and calculate. For my project, the way that the durations last, the top line is actually, I forget these are touchscreen. The top line, even though, again, the quantity of task is not indicative of length, it happens to be the case for my project. So scheduling. This is one way that you can show your schedule. Gantt charts, I'm a big fan. They are great. Essentially what you would do, and there's some software that I'll show you or mention to you at the end of the presentation that you can use. You can create your own using a program like Excel, or you can actually download templates and do them. And what you would do is just put in your activities, the duration of each activity, and it auto-populates these beautiful Gantt charts for you so that you can monitor the progress of your project. The other really neat thing is that you can also denote when you have milestones. So for our project, for instance, it's kind of hard to read the text, but some of our tasks include things like duplicating the film, reviewing the film, writing essays for the film, and those are all processes that take months to complete. But then we have milestones, so things like a report being due, or when we hit a specific number or percentage of newspapers that have been digitized, we consider that a milestone. So keeping that in mind when you're doing your Gantt charts. So one of the other important elements of project management is cost management. And what you want to do essentially is estimate costs for anything and everything that's going to be involved with your project. That includes labor, supplies, overhead, maintenance. Essentially, estimating resources, or everything from, if most of you that are aware with doing projects on campus, direct, indirect costs, all that has to be factored in to your project. The one element that I'm not going to cover in this presentation, but I feel that does relate, is there is another element in project management called procurements, and that deals with purchasing, which is also a really important element to keep in mind when you have to purchase hardware or technology, if you're purchasing a service, if someone's going to host a website for you, for example. So keeping that in mind as well when you're estimating your costs. And then determining your budget is just really knowing like what budget do you have to work with, what funds are actually available for your project. And controlling costs. So that involves monitoring the status of your project and making sure that your expenses aren't surpassing what your actual funds are. So Again, you can use stuff similar to like a Gantt chart if you wanted to, or use Microsoft Excel, et cetera. Like there's different technologies that we'll go over at the end that'll help you keep track of your costs so you're not going over. So human resources. The first thing you want to do with human resources is acquire a team, and that's identifying anyone who is going to be part of your project, whether they be internal to your organization or external to your organization. Once you have your team, you want to develop your team. And what that means is essentially putting to use your interpersonal and communication skills, and we'll talk a little bit more about communication in the next slide. But definitely making sure that you are communicating expectations and whatnot with your team. And then you're assigning roles and assigning activities. And I have here from the PMBOK guide, or the Project Management Body of Knowledge Guide, which is their like big handbook. It's up online through the UF libraries if any of you want to use it. It's like 600 pages. It has so much information and is so detailed. But essentially, you would create an organization chart for your project, so you know who falls under who. You can then even do something like a responsibility chart or a role description, which would just be a text version of this chart. But this essentially would list out who is involved in your project and what they're responsible for. And this is something you create during the planning process so that right from the get-go, everyone is on the same page and knows what's expected of them. And then training your team to enhance their competencies. In terms of collaborating, so what methods are you going to use? Are you going to hold meetings? How often are you going to hold meetings? Do you want to maybe use a project management tool? And I'll show you a few at the end. But do you want to maybe use a project management tool instead to communicate with your project team and share information? And then it's important to build your team. So as I'm sure you all have experience even with your personal lives, if you meet someone, it takes you some time to get acquainted and get used to knowing how they work. Things that bug them, things they don't, just interests in general. So it's getting to know your team. And then it's important that you communicate effectively, because if you're not communicating tasks and expectations, then you're just increasing risk that your project's not going to succeed. As a project manager, you want to make sure that you motivate your team so that you're recognizing and you're rewarding your team's efforts. And then feedback. And this kind of goes both ways, from the project manager to the team and the team to the project manager, kind of keeping those communication waves open. So communication. It's estimated that about 90% of a project manager's time is spent communicating. And so it's very important that you have these, this is just some of the, what seems like never-ending list of important skills that you can have. Some of them being active listening, educating so that you're increasing your team's knowledge and effectiveness, motivating your team, providing them encouragement, and then negotiating, especially when dealing with vendors and agreements and contracts. That's an important skill. So dimensions of communication. So you have internal, so within your project, external being with everyone outside of your project. Formal being things like reports, meeting minutes. Informal being things like emails. Official being things like an annual report or a newsletter that you're going to share with everyone. Or unofficial being things like off the record. Written and oral, so not just what you're saying, but how you're saying it, your pitch, your tone, your inflection. And then nonverbal, so what are you saying when you're not speaking, or even when you are speaking? What's your body language? Like, how are you presenting yourself? How are you communicating things? Facial expressions can say a lot, even when you're not saying something, so that's definitely important to keep in mind. When planning communication, you have to think of who's working on the project, who needs the information, when is the information going to be needed, how is it going to be shared, how is it being stored. Also important to keep in mind time zones when you're dealing with people and communicating, right? So if you, like with us in our project, we work with people in Puerto Rico. They are on the same time zone, but their cultural differences make them kind of fall behind, or even just their infrastructure in general. So keeping things like that in mind. You also have things like language barriers, which can also be an issue. You also want to think of things like what channels are required, and then who's responsible for actually communicating what it is that you're trying to communicate. In terms of managing, you want to think of, again, choice of media. So to who and when are you going to use face-to-face? Or are you going to use emails? Are you using reports? Listening techniques. So again, it's very important that you actively listen, not only to make sure that you're understanding what's going on, but that you're clarifying maybe any misconceptions or misunderstandings that your team might have. Your writing style, so active and passive voice, your word choices even. Are you accurately describing what needs to be done? Is it being received correctly? Are they understanding what you mean? And then your presentation techniques, which is again, really just falls on like body language and nonverbal cues. So project partnerships. Before you start up a partnership, you might want to ask yourself, do I need to work in a partner? Maybe that's not necessarily the case. Like maybe your project doesn't require it, but maybe it does. If so, what is the partnership going to deliver that you can't accomplish on your own? What role is the partnership what roles are the partners gonna play in this partnership? So for instance, us and the University of Puerto Rico, we've had this long-standing relationship even before the inception of my project, where we did work for one another, us especially, like we hold a large collection of material from Puerto Rico, and we both have the same goals of preserving and sharing content. So it made sense for us to partner and work on this project together. So benefits, you have enhanced access to resources, not just equipment, but people. In terms of people, that also enhances the quality of your work because you are bringing people together with different areas of expertise. So that's important. And then, of course, that leads to innovation and creation of new material and new things, and potentially even possible new collaborations at the end of this project. So building your partnerships. It's important that in the beginning phases, you set a foundation, set that kind of stepping stone for this partnership. You're gonna be open, honest, and trusting with one another, right? Because if you don't really have those elements, then this partnership probably won't work. Understanding each other's work habits and the organization cultures, especially if you're working with partners that are external to your home organization. And then making sure that you agree upon what the outcomes are gonna be and what your roles are going to be in this partnership. So that can lead to some challenges if you are not kind of from the get-go really being clear with what your expectations are of one another, right? So one partner could be doing more work than another, which could lead to resentment. Same thing with dominance, if maybe one partner is kind of overstepping. And then communicating, so lack of communication really can affect a project drastically. So definitely making sure, again, that you're keeping these connections open with your partners. Quality management. So this is a concept that actually emerged in the manufacturing sector. And because project management is used a lot in that field, they've adopted it. It's the process of ensuring that quality expected by the customer is achieved. And it not only ensures the quality of the product or service that you are producing, but also the steps along the way that make this, that allow you to get to this product or end goal. So you have to, before you actually start, right, you want to think of quality. What does quality mean to your project? And then you're going to have a plan set in place for quality. And I feel like I'm just touching very briefly on all this. If you guys want more information, I'm more to talk to you afterward. And I'll have slides for resources. But there's just so much involved with all of this that don't really have the time to cover everything. But there are different plans and methods that they recommend that you can use to make sure that you actually are achieving the quality. And then controlling it. So again, making sure that as you're implementing this project, you're meeting the control metrics or the quality metrics that you had set in place. So what happens when quality is not met? Lots of things that are not good. It can lead to more defects, more rework, schedule delays, even poor morale with your team, and then even potentially loss of a customer or a funder. Risk management. is a process that's done ongoing. This is definitely something that happens from the very beginning all the way to the very end of a project. Essentially, projects are about changing something. And so when you are starting up a project, you want to think about all the risks that can possibly affect your project. And risks, which was interesting to me going through some project management courses to become project management certified, kind of eye-opened this for me. I always thought of risk as a negative thing. They also make sure to mention that risk can be positive. So you have risks that are negative, such as threats, and then you have risks that are positive, such as opportunities. And of course, they emphasize that you should try and increase the probability and likelihood that these opportunities will arise so that you can be more successful, while at the same time decreasing the probability that these threats are going to occur, because you obviously want your project to succeed. So some of the risks are identified here. It's pretty much the majority of the elements involved in project management, so communication, your stakeholders, quality, time, etc. So in terms of identifying risks, again, you at the very beginning want to identify what could go wrong, how likely is this to happen, and what is the impact that this is going to have on my project and my project resources. In terms of analysis, you would do like you do with your stakeholders or activity lists. You're going to create a list, a checklist for these risks, and essentially just list out anything and everything that you can think of. And this is kind of like a hive mind activity, right? You do this with your team, you do this with your stakeholders, kind of get everyone to think about what could possibly go wrong or go well that was not planned for with this project. And then you want to analyze the risks as well. And there's several different methods for doing this, both quantitative and qualitative, that I'm happy to go over a little bit more at a different time. So the third phase of project management is executing, which essentially involves putting the plan to action, right? The doing part of the project. So think of this as doing your research when you're actually going out and collecting data, doing your experiments. And these are just some of the activities that would be incorporated in this executing phase. Then you have your monitoring and controlling process, which involves tracking, reviewing, and managing your project progress and performance. And this is done at all times throughout your project. It's not something that you just focus on in one particular phase. It's something that's happening at all times, because you want to make sure that what you planned is what's actually happening and that there aren't variances. So think of this as when you're doing research. Is the work that you're doing supporting your research? Is it not? Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Do you maybe need to reevaluate or redesign what you're doing? And these are just some of the activities that are involved with monitoring and controlling. So controlling the schedule, controlling the budget, controlling communications. Evaluating. So evaluating is a good way to learn from the experience. And it's common practice, especially with project management, to disseminate this information, right? You want to evaluate what you've done, and then you want to share it so that everyone can kind of learn from it. So with the evaluation process, you're answering things like, did your project achieve the outcomes? Did it maybe achieve unplanned outcomes? Was the project completed on time and within budget? What was the impact it had on your stakeholders? What did you learn from the project while you were executing it? And then what would you do differently if you were to take on a similar project? Or maybe did you learn something that you can implement with a different type of project? In terms of, so before you get to actually doing the evaluation and review, you have to think of designing it. So who needs the information? What information is required? How is the information going to be obtained? When is it going to be collected, and how is it going to be analyzed? Collecting information, so it could be things as simple as, and it really depends on what type of project it is that you're handling, but something as simple as the number of hours your staff worked, the number of hits your website got, the number of times your product is being used, etc. And then analysis, again, kind of like with risks, there's quantitative and qualitative. So quantitative being, performing simple statistics, kind of crafting then out graphs or charts to show your evaluation process. Or with qualitative, maybe it's just reviewing and determining trends and then putting out summaries. And then disseminating this information. So are you going to write a report? Who is the report to? Is it to your funder maybe? Are you going to maybe put out a press release or maybe hold a community event? So would you, depending on your project, right? Like, I know with our project, the Florida and Puerto Rico newspaper project, we do things like that where we try and go out to the public and publicize what it is that we're doing and what we've completed in terms of the newspaper pages that are available and how they can be used. And then conferences, like are there any conferences that you can maybe apply to present about your project? And even something as simple as a website or an IR, right? Where you can, an institutional repository, where you can upload this content and share it with everyone publicly and openly. So in terms of closing, this is essentially completing all the tasks necessary for your project that were outlined in your plans, obtaining formal closure of any contracts that you may have opened, obtaining formal closure from the funders and the administration that are overseeing your project, producing maybe final reports, and then collecting these records, right, for lessons learned. So again, you know, like, what did I learn while I was doing this? What can I maybe do differently in the future? And then transferring of ownership. So just kind of that final step of like, here, the project's done, it's complete. So almost like with like a thesis or dissertation, right, when you turn in your final paper. And then just to go over some tools that I think are useful. I have not used all of these myself, but I've heard lots of great things. So I figured that the ones that I've heard of and kind of reviewed a little bit online, I would tell you about. So Microsoft Project, I have not used, but I've watched several videos, and I'm really dying to get my hands on it, but it's very expensive. I use things like Trello currently, and this is a screenshot of some of our activities. So with Trello, you can essentially create like these stacks of cards, and then each stack allows you to put in different cards or tasks. Each task in itself can be opened, where you can then include a checklist, let's say. And as you complete things that you check them off, it tracks your progress. You can give it a due date. You can assign it to someone. You can give it a color label. So there's a lot of things that you can do with Trello, and it is collaborative. So you could invite others to join your team and then use it that way to kind of keep track of your project. And it also does allow you to add attachments. So you could share documents and things this way as well. Basecamp, which I know is offered at UF. Haven't used it yet, but I will be soon for another project. But I know, again, it seems like a really collaborative tool where you can kind of chat amongst one another, share documents, and collaborate a little bit more. Then we have things, tools for scheduling. So one that I've used a lot, Microsoft Excel, and even Smartsheet is really nice. This is just a screenshot of an example from Smartsheet. So you would just put in all your tasks and subtasks, start dates and end dates, and then you can put in, if you're assigning it to a specific person, how long it's going to take, and then this automatically creates a Gantt chart for you, which is really nice. Definitely helps with the monitoring of your project so that you can keep track of schedule and progress to make sure you're completing your task on time. Some other tools that are useful. I'm a big fan of calendars. Google and Outlook run my life. Everything and everything is on them. They're really nice too because they can be also collaborative, right? Like you can invite people to certain tasks or events on your calendars. You can set reminders, which is really helpful. And then communication tools, things like WordPress. So like with our project, for instance, we have a blog up where we can then share information with the public. But you have to think too, it's like, do you want to maybe do that internally for your project? Would that work? Would that be effective for you? Things like Slack, which I've started to use recently, has been really helpful. For those of you that are not familiar, this allows you essentially to create these like rooms for your project, so you can have several of them technically, and then within each room, you can set up different channels. So you can have, let's say for a project, create a room, and then each channel could be like a separate like major task per se for your project. And then within those channels, you can add information specifically related to that task or activity. You can attach documents, and then you can even, I learned recently that you can also add, like there's add-ons, so that you can do something like if you use Microsoft OneDrive, for instance, you can link it, and it'll automatically pull links for you so that you can then collaborate a little easier. And then things like Skype or Skype Business, which are really great internally, right? So one of the girls I work with on my project, her and I, instead of emailing each other for little things, we get on Skype and we message each other. Just use a quick IM. Hey, I found this, or hey, I need that, really quick. It's really nice and simple. Or you could even use it for video conferencing and web conferencing. Some of the things not listed on here, but that are also useful, things like Adobe Connect, GoToWebinar, and even social media could be useful for your project depending on what it is that you're doing. And then just some budgeting tools as well. So I'm a big Microsoft person. I love Excel. Definitely very useful. And then Open Office Calc, which I have not used, but I've heard great things about it. It's an open access software that's online that you can download and use. And then just some resources. So again, I can't stress enough how much information is in the PMBOK guide. And the library does have like a subscription to the ebook version of it. So you would be able to access that. Lynda.com is also really great, not only for reviewing and learning more about the project management and its processes, but also to learn more about like the tools, texts, and software that are available. So they have like tons of Microsoft tutorials available that you can use, just to name some. The PMtraining.com is an organization. You do have to pay for it, but if you're interested in learning more about project management, I would recommend it. I just, a couple months ago, finished training with them, and it was extremely beneficial. Things like the Ohio State University Project Management Research Toolkit, where they have all sorts of templates for like charters, Gantt charts, stakeholder lists, et cetera, that are really helpful. And then even here within the libraries, we have a few sites that are available. We have our own project management toolkit that was developed for the libraries. We have a project charter presentation that was created by Lori, who's here somewhere. And then our project charter resources. So this essentially provides like a template for a project charter that you can maybe implement and use. And then there's some other project management courses that are available through some universities. UF actually used to be on this list, and for like a year now, they haven't offered these classes. I'm not exactly sure why, but you know, they stopped offering them. And then just my contact information. If you have any questions or want to get together and talk some more about project management afterward, I'd be happy to. You can email me or find me on Twitter. And then, just because I couldn't help myself, our project, to tell you all about it. So you can follow us on Twitter too, or our blog post. And then just to take you back to the very beginning so that you guys have the link. I know it'll be posted later along with the recordings, but so you have the link to the presentation in case you want to review it. And we're done with about 15 minutes early, so I don't know if you guys have any questions or anything I can answer or maybe explain to you a little bit more about. If not, then we can just get going earlier. Yes, Margarita?
Can you tell us a little bit more about this, the training that you just...
The training?
Yeah.
Yeah, so the training that I took it because I want to become project management certified. And so essentially it was like a prep course. Like it was 8 weeks long. You met several times a week. But they essentially go through like in depth, like everything that's in this PMBOK guide. They go through like the entire detail of anything that could be on the test, like how things are usually asked on the test. And then they just give you a very detailed explanation as to like every single element available, like that's part of project management. So like what I went over is like barely touching the surface. There's so much stuff. They do a really good job of kind of going more in depth, kind of explaining things a little bit more. And then like the different tools and techniques that you would use with each element. So like for cost, like the different things, the different methods you can use to determine cost. With risk management, what the different analyses types are. So they do a really good job of that, but you do have to pay for it, so. It's expensive. That's what I'll say. You can look it up online.
Okay.
Yes?
How Say quickly that I took some online classes through the College of Education, and they have a class on project management.
Oh, that's great.
It was all online. Yeah, it was an 8-week course, and it went a little more in depth, like you were saying. It seems to be a wide subject.
Yeah, there's so much to it.
Yeah, and we did a project through it. I can't remember, it was EME, but I cannot remember the section or the
6235.
Yeah, I didn't know the College of Education offered it, because I know that the project management program that I was aware of was run through the College of Construction, BCN.
Okay.
Ran it, because it's again it's very big in that field, but I wasn't aware that they did it through the College of Education as well.
This class is called Managing Educational Projects. So
Okay.
you work with the textbook
So a little
that's
more. There's a new textbook that came out that I actually just recently bought that's put out by the Project Management Institute that you guys might be interested in. If you're interested more, I can share the title with you. I don't know off the top of my head, but it's been helpful. So, hi.
Hey. Actually, I'm from the Construction Management School.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah. I would like to know about your motivation for getting that certification. I think that you're going to take the PMP
Yeah.
certificate.
Yeah, it's a little scary.
For me, it makes sense. Project management, construction, other things, but
Yeah.
I would like to know your motivation and how do you think it will help you in the future?
I think it's been helpful now. So when I started off in this position, I didn't have any inkling whatsoever toward this, but doing that it's really opened my eyes to the different elements, risk, cost, scheduling, etc., that are so embedded in projects just by the nature of projects, that I felt like it'd be nice to further develop my understanding, right, and my knowledge of this. And so I just kind of first started off just watching videos and things and didn't feel like they were really doing much for me. And so I was like, well, I'm going to look into this some more, and just started doing some more research and learning more on myself. And then I decided to kind of jump the gun and take the course, which really helped. It's definitely helped me now think back, even with this project now, it's like going back and thinking of risk management plans, right? Budgeting management plans. So now I'm going retrospectively and thinking of, okay, what elements of project management can I implement that would help me more effectively make sure that we're meeting our goals and our objectives. And then on top of that, I've now started doing other things, other projects that are not what I mainly do, that I feel like this would also benefit in. So I do feel like it's something that I might not be including every single element, right? Or at least not to the full extent that is just explained in the PMBOK guide, for instance. But there are several elements that I've learned about that I feel like are useful and would be useful even for just general life projects. So it's been helpful. Any other questions, comments?
Thank you.
Yeah, I hope you guys found it useful. It was not, I know, as impressive or fun as the techie stuff earlier, but the goal was that it would be useful and informative. So I hope that I accomplished that for you guys. And again, if you have any questions or want to get together, just shoot me an email. So, yeah, thank you guys.